Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at a reading and helping us understand how to detect bias in the news media. For this particular part of the lesson, all you have to do is answer the key concept questions by filling in the chart for each criteria of analyzing and detecting bias in the news. So let's go and get started with the reading, and please remember that you can replay any part of this presentation or reading for detailed clarity or repetition later on. Let's begin. The media have tremendous power in setting cultural guidelines and in shaping political discourse. It is essential that news media, along with other institutions, are challenged to be fair and accurate. The first step in challenging biased news coverage is documenting bias. Here are some questions to ask yourself about a newspaper, a TV, and radio news. Number 1. Who are the sources? Be aware of the political perspective of the sources used in a story. Media over-rely on official, government, corporate, and establishment think tank sources. For instance, FAIR found that in 40 months of Nightline programming, the most frequent guests were Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, Elliot Abrams, and Jerry Falwell. Progressive and public interest voices were grossly underrepresented. To portray issues fairly and accurately, media must broaden their spectrum of sources. Otherwise, they serve merely as megaphones for those in power. A way to do that is to count the number of corporate and government sources versus the number of progressive, public interest, female, and minority voices. Demand mass media expand their Rolodexes. Better yet, give them lists of progressive and public interest experts in the community. Number 2. Is there a lack of diversity? What is the race and gender diversity at the news outlet that you watch compared to the communities it serves? How many producers, editors, or decision makers at news outlets are women, people of color, or openly gay or lesbian? In order to fairly represent different communities, news outlets should have members of those communities in decision-making positions. How many of the experts these news outlets cite are women and people of color? FAIR's 40-month survey of Nightline found that U.S. guests to be 92% white, 89% male. A similar survey of PBS NewsHour's found in guest list was 90% white, 87% male. Demand that the media you consume reflect the diversity of the public that they serve. Call or write media outlets every time you see an all-male or all-white panel of experts discussing issues that affect women and people of color. Number 3. From whose point of view is the news reported? Political coverage often focuses on how issues affect politicians or corporate executives rather than those directly affected by the issue. For example, many stories on parental notification of abortion emphasize the tough choice confronting male politicians, while quoting no women under 18, those with the most at stake in the debate. Economics coverage usually looks at how events impact stockholders rather than workers or consumers. So we can demand that those affected by an issue actually have a voice in the presentation of the coverage. Next, are there double standards? Do media hold some people to one standard while using a different standard for other groups? Youth of color who commit crimes are referred to as super predators, whereas adult criminals who commit white-collar crimes are often portrayed as having tragically been led astray. Think tanks partly funded by unions are often identified as labor-backed, while think tanks heavily funded by business interests are usually not identified as corporate-backed. So exposing the double standard by coming up with a parallel example or citing similar stories that were covered differently is key. Next here is thinking about stereotypes. Do stereotypes skew coverage? Does coverage of a drug crisis focus almost exclusively on African Americans, despite the fact that the vast majority of drug users are white? Does coverage of women on welfare focus overwhelmingly on African American women, despite the fact that the majority of welfare recipients are not black? Are lesbians portrayed as man-hating and gay men portrayed as sexual predators, even though a child is 100 times more likely to be molested by a family member than by an unrelated gay adult? So we must understand to educate journalists about misconceptions involved in stereotypes, even they are not immune, and about how stereotypes characterize individuals unfairly. What are unchallenged assumptions? Asking that of a news network and source is key. Often the most important message of a story is not explicitly stated. For instance, in coverage of women on welfare, the age at which a woman had her first child will often not be reported, the implication being that the woman's sexual promiscuity, rather than institutional economic factors, are responsible for her plight. Coverage of rape trials will often focus on a woman's sexual history, as though it calls for her credibility in question. After the arrest of William Kennedy Smith, a New York Times article dredged up a host of irrelevant personal details about his accuser, including the facts that she had skipped classes in 9th grade, had received several speeding tickets, and went on a date and talked to other men. Is the language loaded? When the media adopt loaded terminology, they help shape public opinion. For instance, media often use right-wing buzzword racial preference to refer to affirmative action programs. Polls show that this decision makes a huge difference in how the issue is perceived. A 1992 Lewis Harris poll, for example, found that 70% said that they favored affirmative action, while only 46% favored racial preference programs. So, from this type of talking point, we must challenge the assumption directly. Often bringing assumptions to the surface will demonstrate their absurdity. Most reporters, for example, will not say directly that a woman deserved to be raped because of what she was wearing. Demonstrate how the language chosen gives people an inaccurate impression of the issue, program, or community. Next, is there a lack of context? Coverage of so-called reverse discrimination usually falls or fails to focus on many of the institutional factors which gives power to prejudice, such as larger issues of economic inequality and institutional racism. Coverage of hate speech against gays and lesbians often fails to mention increases in gay bashing and how the two might be related. So, provide the context. Communicate to the journalist or write a letter to the editor that includes the relevant information. Understanding here, do the headlines and stories themselves match? Usually, headlines are not written by the reporter, since many people just skim headlines anyway. Misleading headlines have a significant impact, though. A classic case, in a New York Times article on June 1988, U.S.-Soviet summit in Moscow, Margaret Thatcher was quoted as saying of Reagan, "Poor dear, there's nothing between his ears." The Times headline, Thatcher's salute to Reagan years. Call or write the newspaper and point out the contradiction. And of course, try your best to bridge perception and reality. And down here at the bottom, are stories on important issues featured prominently? Look at where your stories appear. Newspaper articles on the most widely read pages, the front pages and the editorial pages, and lead stories on television and radio will have the greatest influence on public opinion. When you see a story on government officials engaged in activities that violate the Constitution on page 829, call the newspaper and object. You let the paper know how important you feel about an issue is and demand that important stories get prominent coverage. So, as you guys can see, there's a wide variety of tactics and tricks, if you will, that combine to form our collective understanding about how we view news networks fairly and objectively. If you want to get the best news, and if you want to interpret it in the best way possible, keeping these tips and tricks in mind certainly helps. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.